Okay, look, we'll make a start. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Daniel Tramontana from BGL Corporate Solutions, and I'm delighted to be able to bring to you two great people in the industry that I know, and Mark Pizzicala in particular, who is the managing partner at BDO, is also a board member at BDO on the board there, and he's also a member of the board of taxation. And I've known Mark for a very long time, and not only is Mark a great influence, but he's also very, very knowledgeable in a very broad range of tax topics. And I just love what he's able to contribute to the community, and we thank him for it. And Mark, welcome on board today. Great to have you with us again.
Thanks for having me along.
And I'd also like to introduce Matthew Blum. Now, Matthew Blum is an associate director at BDO. He's also a registered liquidator, and he's really importantly for people to know this, is an eligible restructuring practitioner. And welcome, Matthew, to today's session. And it's great to have you on board also.
Thank you, Daniel.
And look, we're going to jump straight into it. And what we're going through today is the whole topic of the small business restructuring law reform. And what Matthew is going to guide us through with the support of Mark is why this whole topic is really important. We're going to dig into what the law reform is, when it should be considered, and the issues that are impacting accountants, and what accountants really need to be aware of when working and operating and guiding their clients in this space. At the end, they're going to go through some key takeaways and questions, but I'd just like you to know also that during the presentations, you feel free to ask questions. Both Mark and I will be monitoring the questions that do come through. We will jump in and interrupt when we feel that the right question comes up, or what we'll do at the end, we may pick a number of questions for Matthew to go through. We'll just work it out as it goes. But welcome, Mark and Matthew, to the audience. I hope that you really enjoyed today's topic and that you walk away with some really great key points to better help facilitate you and position you strongly with your clients when it comes to this whole really important topic. Matthew, over to you.
Well, I might just say a couple of words there, Daniel, before Matthew kicks in, but just to say that, when we were looking at topics, this was a really important one because it is brand new. It applies in 2021 and it is part of the suite of products, which the government has introduced to assist SMEs in these trying times, and they are still trying times, even though the economy is turning around. Not, different sectors in the community are being impacted in different ways. And this small business restructuring process is designed to help businesses restore, if you like, their liquidity. It's not a formal restructuring process, and directors do have control over trading in their business as they try and trade out of difficulty. So I'll hand over to Matt to take us through the detail.
Thanks, Mark. And thank you to the BGL family for having me. Just to provide everybody with a bit of context and the backstory, I probably don't need to mention that anything about the pandemic last year, but what's quite interesting is as we slowly re-emerge from our Christmas break and the corporate world starts returning to their offices and CBDs gradually creep up to capacity. In some states, they're close to getting there already, but I know in Melbourne, they're far from it. And I was in Sydney last week and there wasn't the usual traffic in the CBD, but as everybody re-emerges, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's a pretty uneventful start to the year. It all seems quite sleepy on the surface. So what I would communicate here is that even though it seems quite calm on the surface, there are a number of changes in the background that are taking effect. And we know about some of the measures that were implemented last year, but perhaps what's not communicated as widely is just when those measures finish. And I'll run through them quickly. So the JobKeeper well-publicised support program finished 3 weeks ago. Then we've got directors being protected from insolvent trading. That was a great measure that the government brought in, finalised at the end of last year. The idea there was to stop directors from panicking and feeling like they had to cease trading and perhaps liquidate their businesses and then stave off any widespread flow-on effect from that. So directors were protected from insolvent trading, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is later. But going on from that, tenants were protected from landlords with the mandatory code of conduct. So a tenant that had to close their business, say, due to restrictions, had that code of conduct there to help with any disputes or negotiate payment arrangements, deferrals and discounts. So that was a massive measure for the businesses that were perhaps impacted the most from the restrictions. Now, to be eligible for that code of conduct, you needed to be eligible for JobKeeper. And as I've just mentioned, that ended towards the end of last month as well. So that protection of that landlord code of conduct is starting to phase out as well. Now, financier and ATO deferrals and their sympathy will start to change. Informally, we've been advised that the ATO will step up their recovery action again over the next 1, 2, 3 months. How much they do that will remain to be seen. And then also financiers won't necessarily be as sympathetic as they were. And then finally, but perhaps most importantly, the statutory demand protection that was in place has now fully phased out as at the end of last month. And just to explain why I think that was quite critical in the process, a creditor that was owed money was in effect delayed by 6 months as to how they could go about recovering that. So previously, a creditor that wanted to recover their funds, they were unpaid, they wanted to take legal action against the company, they'd usually start that with a stat demand, and that stat demand had a 21-day lead time before they could then apply to wind up a company. Now, what's occurred there was the government extended that stat demand period from 21 days to 6 months. So you can imagine that a lot of creditors were deterred from taking any action because it was going to take 6 months. So rather than starting that process, a lot of solicitors advise their clients that they should just wait for that period to expire, which started to phase out on the 31st of December and then fully phased out at the end of March. So at the end of March, creditors wanting to pursue their debts didn't have to wait 6 months anymore. Now they've gone back to the normal 21-day lead time on stat demands. So I think what we'll see is a lot more creditors pushing recoveries of their debts. And for my mind, that's probably what has staved off a lot of insolvencies, because a company director is just not compelled to do something about their situation. And that urgency to act isn't there, which I'll talk about again a bit further later. Don't need to take my word for it. Here are the statistics. So we've got the last 6 years here in this hillside graph of the number of insolvencies per quarter. You can see it jumps up and down. It is somewhat seasonal, where they drop off over the Christmas period and courts are closed and creditors can't take action because the courts are closed. And then if we look at 2015, you can see the peak there where there were a number of the highest number of insolvencies notably. And what happened around about that point in time was that the ATO dropped their thresholds that they were willing to wind up a company for. I don't think it's a coincidence. And so what you could see there was a lot of companies were either pursued by the ATO to wind up stage, or they were compelled through that recovery action to make voluntary appointments. So you could see the spike there, and you can see firsthand, well, this is the impact that monetary policy has on the number of insolvencies. Fast forward to last year, you can see that teal line there really drop off. So we're all aware of the unprecedented times and the impact on businesses. What we didn't expect was an unprecedented drop off in the number of insolvency appointments. And I guess what that tells us there is that those relief measures that the government brought in worked. They staved off widespread insolvencies, and they went even further than that, and they reduced the number of insolvencies far below what they would ordinarily be. If we look at this dotted line there, that is our 5-year seasonal average, and you can see the disparity there, the drop off of approximately 1,000 to 1,500 insolvencies per quarter alone. The question then remains is, have these insolvencies been avoided altogether, or were they simply deferred? And if I slide back to our key drivers here, perhaps JobKeeper is probably the only one of those measures there that will directly improve a financial position of a company. The others largely just defer a problem. So I think what we'll see is a catch up perhaps in insolvencies at some stage, and then on top of that, well, what about the businesses that were detrimentally impacted by the restrictions? So quite an interesting insight there. Where have all these insolvencies gone? Will they be returning, and when? So with further insights, I've delved into some statistics on what happened to the businesses during the peak of the restrictions. Here we can see revenue dropped off, perhaps an obvious conclusion that many of us can draw. But what becomes more interesting is that the businesses that had that revenue drop off didn't seem to also proportionately drop off their expenses. So the revenue decreased, and then they didn't adjust their financial operations to comparatively reduce their expenses. You could draw the inference there that financial losses start to occur. And then further on, employee numbers have largely stayed the same. If we look at that bottom chart there, where you could perhaps say that's a testament to JobKeeper. And then what is also interesting is just those small little red boxes at the right-hand side of each of those charts, where businesses have simply said, I don't know what happened to my financial performance. Now, even though 6, 5, 4, 3% seems like quite a low percentage, when you think of the sheer number of businesses out there, and you apply that percentage to the sheer number of businesses in existence, it's a large number of businesses that just aren't paying attention to their operations, which is quite scary, and that's probably where the accountants in the chat room could come into play.
Where are these statistics from, Matthew, if you don't mind me asking?
It's the Australian Bureau of Statistics conducted a survey.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's unusual that expenses haven't decreased somewhat, if not proportionally, but you would have expected, like, for example, rent and landlord concessions, just as one example, would have meant expenses should have significantly reduced, I would have thought.
Yeah, yep. So it was a bit of an education piece around that code of conduct there, allowing people to reduce their rent. In a lot of instances, it might have just deferred it. So it's perhaps an expense, but it's not going to come home to roost until now or later this year.
Yep.
And then if we keep looking at that middle chart there, it's quite alarming that expenses seem to increase. More businesses had their expenses increase than decrease. So, so whilst on the surface the number of insolvencies has dropped off dramatically, then we scratch below the surface here. We see what's really happened with these businesses. Revenues dropped, expenses are increasing or not decreasing with their revenue. So you can't help but wonder how these losses will impact on their working capital and their balance sheets coming into the second half of this year. So if I talk to a case study about, well, now we've looked at some timeframes around when legislation peels away. We've looked at under the surface of what's really going on in businesses, and then we pull that together to say, well, what can happen to businesses if we had a crystal ball, which no one's got a crystal ball, but things to consider. What I've taken here is perhaps what could be a typical case study. And I'll start with this chart here on the right. Quite simply, we're comparing, say, the working capital of the business, the available resources that they have to meet the red line, which is their debts that are due. And not to scale, but just broadly speaking, during the early stages of 2020 and 2019, a business is travelling along as per usual. They've got plenty of working capital available, more than what is required for the debts that are due. And that's where you see that green line is higher than the red line there. And then what happened in March and April as restrictions were put in place, and then as the Australian Bureau of Statistics stats tell us, revenue dropped, but expenses didn't drop proportionately. So what tends to occur in my experience is that people start to use up their working capital to meet those expenses, particularly if they're not adjusting their operations and their workforce or their overheads. So that's where you start to see that green line really start to drop away, say in the middle to late part of last year. And then all of a sudden, a business has more debts due, or around about the same amount of debts due as they've got means to pay them. And then that brings us to March of this year, or today, when we start seeing a lot of those relief measures peel back. And then the ability for a company to defer their liabilities is dramatically reduced, or at least reduced from a formal mechanism such as a code of conduct, or financiers being compelled to provide that sort of relief. And those deferred liabilities, these expenses were always being incurred along the way, but now they've come home to roost, and we see this spike in the debts that become due. So that's perhaps what people's clients will be contending with from here on in in 2021. And then as those debts become due, they're then using their available resources to try and meet those requirements. All of a sudden, we end up with this disparity where instead of what is usually a healthy business that's got plenty of space to be able to make strategic decisions and pay their debts when they need to, when they feel like it. Instead of doing that, you've got all of these creditors that have now got the usual powers to pursue their debts. All of a sudden, they're putting pressure on the company because the company doesn't have the working capital that it once had. And then a concern that a director of a company might have is insolvent trading. I spoke briefly about how directors were protected from insolvent trading liability last year, and they had what they call a safe harbour, where they can continue to trade their business without worrying about that exposure. Now, all of a sudden, that safe harbour's ended, and a director really needs to think about their own personal financial position. What is insolvent trading? If a business continues to incur debts that it can't pay, then a director can be held personally liable for allowing those debts to be incurred. And I'll talk a little bit later about how an accountant should be mindful of that, or can be mindful of that. But in this graph, in this very simplified example, you can see that, well, if all the liabilities that are due are dramatically greater than the available resources, then it would stand to say, well, this company is insolvent, and a director would need to cast their mind to, well, their own personal financial position and how they might be liable for it. And then finally, down the bottom of that chart there, it's just a sliding scale of, well, whilst there's plenty of resources available, there's plenty of runway for a business to be able to come up with initiatives and build a plan and execute it and turn around a business. That's earlier in the piece there when they've got those resources. But unfortunately, what tends to happen a lot of the time is they might wait until creditors are really pressing them for payment and they start receiving those statutory demands, And at that stage, they don't have the same working capital, the same runway to be able to execute initiatives, and their options are impacted by that. And then the takeaway there is, well, as accountants, increasing the urgency to act will provide our clients with a greater number of options comparatively. And then I'll talk a bit more about Safe Harbour, how the directors can continue to be protected soon. Okay, what we're all here for. So what is the reform? Now that we know that it's important, what does it actually do? So the benefits here is it puts a moratorium on creditors and then essentially freezes creditors and gives a business the breathing room that they need to restructure. So where previously a creditor might be able to wind up a company that's stopped unless they've already started the process, and then they can go about devising and implementing a restructuring plan. The difference, which might sound familiar, it might sound a lot like a voluntary administration to people that are aware of what a voluntary administration is. So what an important comparison is that unlike a voluntary administration, directors keep control of the business. As Mark mentioned earlier, in a voluntary administration scenario, an administrator is first-hand trading the business. An administrator is first-hand liable for the expenses of that business, and invariably they'll have little knowledge about the business, and a lot of cost is incurred because they firstly have to get their heads around what the business does, and that exposure for those liabilities that they have personally, and then they're trading it firsthand. So the costs and the labour involved with a voluntary administrator trading a business firsthand is quite high. In this instance, this new reform allows directors to keep their business and trade it themselves, and that all of a sudden becomes far more cost effective. So they avoid that whole cost of handing a business over to a voluntary administrator. So the control part of it is appealing for from a director's perspective because they're keeping their business, but it also presents dramatic cost savings, which then covers off on point 3. One other interesting comparison to a voluntary administration is, and those of you that are familiar with the voluntary administration, I'm going to summarise it in a sentence. It's a formal way for a company to make a deal with its creditors. And even though I've simplified it, it's quite a lengthy, complex process. There's a lot of work involved with it. And then what occurs is the voluntary administrator will put a deal to creditors. Creditors will vote on that deal. And if it's accepted, a business is typically returned to the director and it goes on per usual. In this instance, a plan is put to creditors, much similar to a voluntary administration, but the level of investigations and the reporting involved is far less. And I'll talk a bit more about what a plan needs to look like later. But it's far more cost effective in that sense as well. Now, why the main benefit and the reason why most people would be compelled to go down this small business restructuring path is that they can compromise their creditor claims. Does that mean if they accept a deal, they can pay them less, they can pay them a certain amount of cents in the dollar? I'll talk about why a creditor might be compelled to do that later, or why they wouldn't be compelled to do that. But it really is a key benefit if you think of a scenario where a business has, say, $1 million in liabilities, and it looks like they may need to go into liquidation, but instead of liquidation, a director might put in $200,000 of their own contribution, and creditors get 20 cents in the dollar instead of perhaps nothing in a liquidation. That is a far more appealing proposition for a director than perhaps losing a business. So this item 4 is perhaps the main attraction to why a director might be compelled to pursue this avenue of restructuring. And then guarantees can't be enforced during the process. I will insert a little disclaimer here that this legislation came into effect on 1 January. And it was very hastily put together just because of the circumstances. There are a number of issues that were raised or potential deficiencies that were raised, and as it stands, the courts are filling in some of those gaps in the legislation about what's required by a restructuring practitioner. So whilst I relay all this information to you, it is a little bit of a changing landscape as we see courts help with defining the process for us. So that's, I should mention that disclaimer on the way through. And to put that into context, we've not had a completed restructuring plan as yet. There's been, say, 15, 20 of them commenced, just because it's so brand new and they're underway. But yes, we're still becoming more informed with that whole process, with all this new information. So I'll talk to the eligibility. Who is eligible to pursue this restructuring process? Let's, and you know, I won't repeat verbatim what the screen says, but a $1 million cap is put on liabilities. So it's designed for smaller businesses, smaller companies that have smaller amounts of liabilities. There was a fair bit of criticism when the reform was being prepared to say, well, $1 million, it doesn't take much for a company to tip over $1 million when you start thinking about financiers and employee entitlements and other trade creditors and taxation liabilities. So the initial reaction was that it's quite a narrow scope of eligibility. But that was supported by ASIC to say that, well, of the companies wound up, some 2/3 of those companies were below $1 million and had below $1 million in those liabilities. It excludes related parties, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. The scope is further narrowed by requirements that all employee entitlements are paid and taxation liabilities are up to date. Taxation returns are up to date before a plan is provided to creditors. So regulators didn't want this to be a mechanism for employees to be left out of pocket, and they're bestowing, you know, that regulatory requirement that, okay, well, you still need to have returns up to date so that the taxation office, for instance, can quantify what their debt is. Again, add that to the $1 million eligibility requirement, and you end up with a further narrowing of the scope of who can undertake this restructuring regime. The directors make the appointment. It needs to be an eligible small business restructuring practitioner. A lot of conjecture about who that was going to be, but different to, say, my colleague Mark Pizzicello, who's an expert in, say, CGT restructuring. This small business restructuring for these flailing businesses can only appoint a registered liquidator to conduct that restructuring process, just because of the similarities with the other insolvency processes out there. I think they've loosened up the ability for somebody to purely be registered as an eligible restructuring practitioner. But, you know, time will tell how much that's taken up and if that's a need. I think initially the government thought there was going to be a flood of insolvency appointments, and they were concerned that there weren't going to be the workforce wasn't going to be there to be able to help companies. But as you could see with those insolvency numbers I went through earlier, which is not the case. And then basically directors have one go at going through the process. They can't, in a few years' time, have another business that they want to, you know, essentially discount their debts with. Now that's quite a narrow eligibility, and if I'm going to talk to the headline question of, is this the vaccine for corporate financial distress? Well, if it is, what you've got is only a very, you know, narrow group of businesses that can actually pursue it. So perhaps similar to what Scott Morrison is contending with at the moment, where they've opened up these vaccines to set profile of people. Yes, this by comparison will help with financial distress, but it's only available to a set number of, to a certain profile of businesses. So there are alternatives though. If you've got a client that doesn't fit into this criteria, there are a number of other options that are available. I've listed but a few there. If they're above the debt levels, then a voluntary administration can still be a very effective way of restructuring that balance sheet and allowing a company to continue to trade. A safe harbour plan is a process where directors can have their assets personally protected whilst they undertake a strategy to turn around a business or provide a better outcome to creditors than if they had to put the company into liquidation. And then finally, liquidation is still an option there. So what can help, and I'll talk about it a bit further later, but in weighing up all these options, it's something that I frequently do as we go through a contingency planning process. But we talk about what they look like and then what the status quo looks like, and with all the upsides and downside to each scenario, what should be pursued, help a client to make an informed decision. All right, so this is a map of the restructuring process. I've put this together to tell people, well, what actually happens, who does what, how long does it take, and then what occurs at the end of the process. Just have a quick drink because I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide. Took a little bit of time to put together, but what we have is, and I'll go through from the start to the finish, a business and a director deciding that, okay, well, I need to pursue this restructuring process for a variety of reasons. Those deferred liabilities are now putting duress on them, and they need to fix up their balance sheet, or they're concerned about insolvent trading. So then they appoint a small business restructuring practitioner. The beauty of this new reform here is they get the insolvent trading protection, but they still have control of their business. So whilst they make this appointment, they're still trading their business as they normally would have, with a few caveats there, but that's a main attraction there. So starting from the left of the screen, once a small business practitioner is appointed, what do they actually do? Well, they'll start communicating with creditors, and they'll start conducting some investigations and getting a feel for what assets are there. And whilst doing that, they'll consult with the directors, and they might even provide them with assistance to help them put together a restructuring plan. Before the directors put the restructuring plan to creditors, they need to get their tax returns up to date and ensure their employee entitlements are paid. That's where accountants will perhaps obviously be in high demand there. It might be the case that as an accountant, practical consideration is that you do the work to get the returns up to date prior to the appointment. But yes, it can be done following an appointment if an appointment's urgent. And then once the house is in order and the directors have come up with a plan that they like the look of, they can then submit it to the restructuring practitioner. The restructuring practitioner, unlike a voluntary administration, they don't need to provide an opinion of whether creditors should accept or not, so to speak. It's not a requirement. They may do that, not a requirement under the legislation that's been brought in. But what they do need to look at is it reasonably likely to succeed? So this plan, it's great. Yes, they're going to put this strategy in place and they're going to make these repayments, but is it feasible? Will it happen? And then they provide, once they make that declaration, they provide it to creditors. So if they can't make the declaration, then they may reject the plan, and then it can terminate the restructuring process. So what happens the restructuring process is terminated, that insolvent trading protection's lost. The small business practitioner is removed, and there's no longer that protection there for directors from insolvent trading. A business is automatically deemed to be insolvent, which is an important thing to mention there. But inherently, before they make an appointment, directors have usually come to terms with that already. Now, so that's what the first 20 business days looks like.
I thought I might just ask a quick question, Matt. So I noticed that you've got two things running in parallel there, the practitioner and then the role of the directors. Now, is the practitioner meant to assist the directors coming up with a plan? Like, are these processes mutually exclusive, or are they sort of dependent on each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. The legislation doesn't necessarily provide that clarity. There's no obligation necessarily for the practitioner to assist the directors, but it's a catch-22. How is a director supposed to prepare a feasible plan without their guidance? And I would suggest that even though it doesn't necessarily fall in their domain, the restructuring practitioner is not the one forming the plan, they're the one receiving it. It would be wise to involve them in that process. So to answer your question, Mark, not rigorously a legislative requirement, but definitely a benefit. And to extend
it would seem to me that if the practitioner or the small business restructuring practitioner, if their role is a review function only, then potentially the directors will need support or help from either their accountants/lawyers to put the plan together.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is a practical consideration.
Yeah.
And somewhere, and depending on the expertise of an accountant, say, there's an opportunity there for them to help a director, the business cash flow forecasts. Right, if we're going to put forward a repayment arrangement of, say, 20 cents in the dollar to creditors, when can we make those payments? What's the timing? What's feasible? And quite often what we see is with directors that we encounter in these situations, sometimes they don't have that capability to do it themselves. And yet definitely there's an opportunity for accountants to help on that front.
Yeah.
So the legislation leaves it open to who helps the directors through that planning process. Scope for accountants to help them through. And I would think whilst devising that plan, it would be wise to bounce it off the practitioner. This small business restructuring process is quite similar to the voluntary administration regime, bar for a couple of carve-outs that save significantly on costs. So I think with the experience that a restructuring practitioner has had through that voluntary administration process, they're probably already aware of the sensitivities for creditors and what their considerations might be. During this process, they will have had communications directly with creditors. So they would know what might be more likely to be accepted or not. So yeah, it's a little bit of a quirk there and a catch-22 where, but I would suggest, Mark, that the directors aren't alone in that process and they can get guidance. So assuming then that the directors put together this plan, and I'll talk a bit more about the nitty-gritty of what a plan would look like soon. The restructuring practitioner then puts that plan to creditors, and creditors vote on it. Again, another cost saving by comparison to a voluntary administration is that there isn't a meeting process unless there's extraordinary circumstances. Rather, creditors are just given this deadline, generally speaking, a 15 business day deadline. So let's say the directors put this plan together. I'll keep using the example of 20 cents in the dollar. individual results will vary for individual companies, but hypothetically 20 cents of the dollar is put to creditors, then they then respond whether they accept that proposal or reject it. The requirement is 50% approval for it to be, more than 50% approval for it to be accepted. And then let's say, hypothetically, to follow this map through, if it's not approved, then that restructuring process is terminated, and then the restructuring practitioner is removed, and the business, the company reverts to normal, except it's deemed to be insolvent, and then it is exposed to creditor actions. It's no longer provided that protection of staving off those creditors, and directors are then exposed to that insolvent trading issue again. It isn't automatically put into liquidation, which is a definite positive of the legislation. It just, the restructuring practitioner is simply removed from the process. So that's what happens if creditors reject the proposal. But let's say creditors approve the proposal, then the restructuring plan moves into that execution stage, that implementation stage. So depending on what the proposal looks like, directors then have that role of completing those contributions to that fund. So the beauty of these proposals is they can be quite flexible. And if it's anything like deals that I've done and documented with creditors in the past, it could be payments over time. It can be that certain assets are contributed to the fund that then the restructuring practitioner realises. It could be that debtors form part of the fund, but the directors, the company guarantees the recovery of those debtors. It's just the tip of the iceberg on the flexibility there. And then the company makes the payments to the funds over time, hypothetically, to give you the most simple example, and then the restructuring practitioner in that top right-hand corner box there, that teal box there, as part of the process, they pay the creditors the distribution. So a payment arrangement's accepted. To give you that simple example, the restructuring practitioner then pays the creditors what can be paid, and then the company is completely restructured. So creditor claims are completely compromised. In essence, the company no longer has those debts. And that brings us to that red box there of the finalisation of that process. I have already spoken about some of the alternatives there, that if a process isn't successfully completed for whatever reason, there are still alternatives available. The time frame's been put out there for 3 years for a plan, but I'll go through some of that in detail now. So what does a plan actually look like? Again, new legislation, so experience is still forming on this front, but essentially these are the key items that are required to be included in that plan in this teal box here. So what's going to be paid into the fund, or what assets will be in the fund to be realised, and then to pay creditors that compromised amount. A plan will usually talk about, we'll need to talk about how remuneration is dealt with. So one of the unique requirements of this legislation is that during that restructuring process, there's a fixed amount of remuneration set at the beginning. You got a question?
Oh, sorry, Matt. I was just going to ask that we've got a question through that's asked. One of the participants has asked the question: is the vote of creditors by number or by value of debt?
It's by value and of responding creditors. So and I think it's by number as well. I'll just have to check that.
Okay, but we can. sorry to put you on the spot. We can always get back to the participants. That's fine.
Yeah, I would need to initially, what was put out there in the drafts was that it was by number and by value.
Yeah.
And it was going to be of all creditors, but as the legislation's come into place, it's for responding creditors, and it was listed for value.
Okay.
But
No worries.
I think, and it's what's also interesting about that question is related parties won't be able to vote, and then you end up in a scenario probably where taxation liabilities will largely carry a vote because they've got that value.
Yeah.
So the ATO's view, just by that dynamic, the ATO's view on a proposal will become quite important. And whilst they have their procedures on how they vote in these scenarios and these policy documents, I would think that there'd be a little bit of, you could call it political influence, but some sympathy for the circumstances that, all right, well, they might be more inclined to accept these proposals than they were before.
Okay.
Is there a second question?
There was, but I'll come back to you on that one later.
Yeah, sure. So remuneration, and this is part of the appeal of the process for company directors, they can set the remuneration of the restructuring practitioner on the outset. It's a requirement. So it might be that, for argument's sake, okay, well, it's $20,000 for a plan to be devised and put in place, and creditors to vote on the process. Could be less for smaller companies or a smaller number of creditors. Could be more depending on the complexity. I think practitioners are faced with the challenge of trying to work out, well, how much should this process cost, because it's completely new. And then, so there's a set amount until the plan's put in place, and then once the plan is put in place, it's a percentage of the return to creditors. So it might be that 5% of whatever gets distributed to creditors is what that practitioner can take in their fee. So it provides a positive there. It provides great clarity to creditors as to what return they should get, because the costs are quite clear on the outset. Sorry, excuse me. And naturally, that the question of what that value is, again, turns on the individual company and their circumstances. Time frame. Now, this is a big consideration. Whilst technically there can be plenty of time for the plan to be put into place, I would suggest, and up to 3 years, I would suggest a shorter time frame. That the shorter the time frame, the better. So if a creditor, for instance, receives a proposal where they're not going to see their money for another 2 or 3 years, then by comparison, it's less attractive than if they were going to receive their funds within 2 or 3 months. So you've got the time value of money, and just their skepticism whether they would actually eventually receive the funds. The greater the time frame as well, and the greater the cost that is involved with the process. And then from the company and director's perspective, they would want to be removed from the formal, from that title process of being under restructuring. So I think from their perspective, the sooner that they are out of the restructuring process, the more water they can put under the bridge, and the better it is for their operations going forward. So whilst there's a long time frame that a plan can be implemented in, invariably I would suggest a shorter time frame would be more beneficial. That said, if a business needs more time to be able to put together a fund and make those contributions, and that provides creditors with a greater return, then there can be a case for a lengthier period of time. Now, it can be conditional where you've got certain funders and White Knights or other parties, financiers that are not taking action, or there might be other reasons why somebody isn't willing to commit to the plan until creditors approve the plan. So if creditors approve the plan, there can be conditions that take place over the next 10 business days. Now, so that's broadly speaking, they're the requirements of what needs to be included in the plan. Now, I've got a few bullet points there on items that, whilst they're not a requirement, it may still be beneficial to correspond with creditors and inform them of this information. So if you were to stonewall a creditor and say, I don't need to give you more than what the repayments are going to be, whilst technically a restructuring practitioner or a director might be able to do that, you've got to remember that these creditors are the ones voting on the plan. So whilst you might not be required to disclose certain information to them, it may still be beneficial. So remembering you want them to accept the plan, and what information might help them accept that plan. Having experiences with this process during the voluntary administration and creditors voting on whether they're willing to accept a lesser amount for their debt, what can come into play aside from the financial decision is the emotional decision. And so this is not something that you'll read in the legislation. Does the creditor have sympathy for the director? A creditor will perhaps want to know why this hardship was experienced. All other things being equal, a business that has had a long history of trading successfully but experienced hardship because of the impact of the pandemic, they may receive more sympathy from a creditor, where a creditor sees that, okay, well, they've explained that they, for whatever reason, they couldn't get people onto a building site for 2 months. Or let's say they had to close their doors, their business altogether for 3-6 months. They might be more willing to have sympathy and think empathetically. So whilst it's a financial decision on whether they vote in favour of this plan or not, they can be driven emotionally there. And they might think to themselves, all right, well, it's not due to the director's mismanagement. It's actually due to external factors, and they might be more inclined to give that director a second chance with the business.
I was just cognizant, Matt, that we've probably got 5 minutes. So just,
okay, right, I'll whiz through it. It can be good to show them a comparison. Well, look, if you don't accept this plan, what are you going to receive in the liquidation? And then it may be good to give them a bit of information about, well, this is what the director is going to do to make sure this issue doesn't happen again. So closing out in the last 5 minutes here, I'll talk about the practical implications for advisors and their clients. Here I've provided some statistics on a key issue here. Now, why do companies fail outside of a pandemic? It's highlighted that it's inadequate cash flow, but I would say that inadequate cash flow is really a symptom of a number of these other issues, like poor financial control, poor accounts receivable. Then sitting second in line is poor strategic management of their business. So year after year, poor strategic management of a business is usually a cause of company failure, aside from poor economic conditions. That's where an accountant can really step in, use their skill set to help a business. What are the red flags they need to look at? When should they step in? Well, if they're aware of clients that were reliant on the likes of JobKeeper, rental relief, that they could be facing recovery action. I've heard a lot of accountants say that over the last year, the taxation office really hasn't been pursuing the debts. Unfortunately, due to the profile of some directors, they may have just allowed debts to accrue in the background, and now they face recovery action and insolvent trading exposure. I'll put this in bold here, is beware of statutory demands. I think they'll become much more active, and keep an eye out for them. That really is a red flag and a point in time when a business should seek help, or an accountant should advocate for some help or provide that help. I've listed some insolvency indicators here. I won't go through all of them, but this is what the court tells us are the indicators of a company being in trouble. A lot of these are pretty obvious on the surface, or a current ratio can be calculated quite quickly. So they are there for people to refer to at a later date. No individual indicator means it's insolvent. Rather, it's a consideration of all of these put together. Continuing losses doesn't mean that they don't have the financial means to absorb that and recover. And so this is just before we head into the key takeaways and wrap it up. What other things should our accountants and advisors be aware of? Being time conscious is the number one priority there. If they advocate early change or they help the business earlier in the piece, then as I've discussed previously, there will be more options available. Be mindful of when directors and owners are about to contribute their funds and what they're going to be used for, because it could be that, well, rather than them, and I see this quite often, they might refinance their house, they might inject 100, 200,000 into a business, but that might not touch the sides and it might not help the issue here. They might just be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Whereas if they start a restructuring process and then say that they're going to contribute that 200,000 as part of a restructuring plan, that can help clear all of their debts. So just be mindful of what's going on in the background there. And then if they do contribute it to the business, also be mindful of employee entitlements needing to be paid for a plan to be considered. We've spoken, Mark and I, we spoke about establishing budgets and bringing returns up to date. There's a big role there for our accountants and advisors. Engaging with stakeholders, thinking of suppliers, how are they going to circumvent a supply issue when a creditor is told that they might only see 20 cents in the dollar, turning their mind to that and sorting that out. And if people aren't, if they don't feel like they're equipped to deal with that issue themselves, put your hand up and then call in that external advisor. We're obviously more than happy to help, and we don't charge at all to provide that contingency planning and just going through those options. And yeah, wrapping up, I'll ask anybody to throw their questions into the Q&A if we've got time. Mark, we might have to take those questions offline, but key takeaways: the restructuring plan is a very powerful tool to help a debt-laden business get a second chance. And then the directors get to retain their business. Not all companies are going to be eligible for it. It's quite a narrow scope of people that are allowed to take advantage of this vaccine. But there are wider options. And then unless our accountants and advisors advocate for change, then then it might be a missed opportunity here. Yep.
Well, that's terrific, Matt. Thank you very much for that. And I don't know if this is up. We don't seem to have any other questions, Daniel.
Sorry, just had a quick look here. No, there was the one question there, is
Yeah.
the value of creditors by number or by value of debt, which I think that you'll come back to.
Yeah.
Look, I suppose I just, we can hang around for a couple of questions if you like, but I think, and we're happy to stay back, but we'll wrap it up. And I'd just like to thank Matthew for that fantastic and very informative presentation. From the feedback I can see already, and there was one comment here, very informative, thank you. It truly was great information, and I hope that it provides with our audience with enough details and information to be able to step into these areas with confidence. Just in regards to the presentation, I can confirm that we will make the PowerPoint slides available. Would that be correct, Mark and Matthew?
That's correct.
Good with that.
And we'll also make the recording of the webinar available also. Look, there's a couple of questions that have just come through, and like for those that have to leave, we'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. We do appreciate your support and engagement. As we said, Matthew and Mark will be around for a little while to answer any questions. So as they're coming through, if they can answer any of those, I'll either answer them live or they'll type an answer for you. But thank you so much. You'll get some correspondence from us soon, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sometimes people like to discuss their questions confidentially, and our details are there to be contacted if they need to.
Yep.
Thank you. And for those people sticking around, did you want to go through these questions now, Daniel or Mark? Or
Look, the first one that's come through, if the director enters into an SBR, are personal guarantees still enforceable?
So they're frozen. So, and if it's terminated, then they become enforceable. So, yeah.
So on the eligibility, 1 million is based on the size of the debt, on the eligibility of the 1 million?
Correct. So total liabilities of 1 million, less than 1 million. So excluding related parties. So if there's a director that's putting hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's taken out of that equation. Yep. And then employee entitlements, the other interesting part of that dynamic there is because employee entitlements need to be brought up to date. Let's say, for instance, there's this superannuation liability. If that's paid, then that can capture that eligibility. Again, that might be the difference between having less than $1 million in liabilities and not.
So Michael's just come back and said, okay, so if it is frozen and SBR ends successfully, are they enforceable post SBR?
I would suggest that they are. I would be mindful of them still being enforceable. And so
why wouldn't they be?
pulling up short of
normal?
What was that, sorry?
I said if things go back to normal, why wouldn't they be?
Yeah, so pulling up short of providing a formal advice here, it is something that an accountant can help a director with. It's amazing how directors don't really keep tabs of the creditors that they've provided guarantees to. So there could be an opportunity there for accountants to think about, well, which creditors have guarantees here and what could be that fallout later in the piece. And just because they think they've provided a guarantee doesn't mean it's necessarily the case. It's amazing that the number of people that either don't pursue it or they've lost the necessary documents or they haven't executed the documents properly, or it's a complex area of law. So yes, it's definitely an interesting question, a good point.
Yep.
Okay, it looks like the questions have come to an end, and if anyone's still around, and there's still a number of participants there, if, they can reach out to you personally, both Matthew and Mark, if they wish, if they want to discuss anything confidentially, and I know that they're in very good hands in doing so. So look, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you everyone once again, and we look forward to engaging with you again in future. And once again, Matthew, Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Good work.
Cheers.